Do you remember the grocery items from the 1980s that vanished? Not because we outgrew them, but because they were banned? Back then, supermarket shelves were filled with color, chaos, and chemicals we didn't think twice about. Looking back now, were we fearless? Or just dangerously unaware of what we were eating? Olestra fat-free chips were the 1980s biggest snack food miracle and one of its most notorious disasters. Marketed as a breakthrough for people who wanted all the flavor of fried chips without the guilt, Olestra promised to change snacking forever. You could eat as many chips as you wanted, they said, and never gain weight. The slogan might as well have been, "Eat fearlessly and pay later." The secret ingredient was Olestra, a fat substitute that your body could not digest. That sounded great on paper until consumers learned it also caused gastrointestinal distress. In plain English, that meant sudden, unstoppable regret. People stocked up, ate entire bags, and then learned firsthand why scientists should not play snack gods. Within months, news outlets were running horror stories, and Olestra became a household punchline. Even though the chips were technically safe, no one wanted to take the risk. The miracle turned into a warning, a symbol of how far companies would go to sell fat-free dreams. By the early 2000s, Olestra snacks were gone, remembered only by those who learned the hard way that some chips really do bite back. Jolt Cola was the 1980s in a can, loud, rebellious, and wired beyond reason. With the tagline, "All the sugar and twice the caffeine," it became the drink of choice for gamers, students, and anyone who thought sleep was optional. The pitch was simple. If coffee was too boring and soda too weak, Jolt would fix both problems, explosively. The neon red logo, the buzz of carbonation, and the rush of caffeine turned it into a cult classic overnight. Teachers hated it, parents feared it, and kids snuck it into backpacks like contraband. Some schools even banned it entirely after students showed up jittering through math class. Jolt's ingredients list read like a dare, packed with more sugar than a candy factory and caffeine levels that made even coffee blush. For a generation raised on excess, it was perfect, until regulators and doctors began sounding alarms about caffeine overload. By the late 1990s, new rules and changing health standards pushed it off many shelves, but its legacy lives on in every modern energy drink. Jolt Cola walked so Monster and Red Bull could sprint, shaking all the way. Red dye. Number 2 was the invisible villain lurking in nearly every 1980s candy aisle. It made cherries brighter, strawberries redder, and fruit punch practically glow in the dark. Kids loved it. Parents did not. In the mid-1980s, scientists began raising red flags, linking the dye to hyperactivity and even potential health risks. Suddenly, that bright candy color looked a little too radioactive for comfort. Companies scrambled to pull products, and supermarkets quietly replaced the neon reds with paler shades of safety. It was one of the first times America realized how much chemistry hid behind natural flavor. Red dye number 2 became a symbol of corporate denial and consumer awakening. By the time it was banned in food production, entire aisles had to be reformulated. Candies, cereals, drinks, all of them changed overnight. What once looked delicious suddenly looked dangerous. Still, for anyone who grew up in the 1980s, that bright, unnatural red remains unforgettable, a warning wrapped in nostalgia. Tab soda was the drink that defined a decade, and then paid the price for it. Introduced by Coca-Cola for calorie-conscious drinkers, it came in that unmistakable pink can with a promise: zero sugar, zero guilt, all taste. The secret weapon? Saccharin. A sweetener that seemed like a miracle until science caught up. When studies linked saccharin to cancer in lab animals, panic spread faster than fizz. Health warnings appeared on cans, and sales plummeted as consumers fled from what suddenly felt like a soda-sized science experiment. Despite the controversy, Tab hung on as a cultural icon, the drink of fashion models, aerobics instructors, and anyone chasing the new body craze of the 1980s. But by the 2000s, Coca-Cola quietly pulled the plug. The soda that once symbolized empowerment had become an outdated reminder of a risk people no longer wanted to sip. In the end, Tab wasn't just a drink. It was a time capsule of a decade obsessed with control, beauty, and the illusion of safety. Kinder. Surprise eggs were the perfect balance of joy and danger. A hollow chocolate egg wrapped in foil, it hid a tiny plastic capsule inside. And inside that, a surprise toy. It was pure childhood wonder in edible form. The problem? American law does not allow non-edible items hidden inside food, especially small ones that can choke a child. Customs agents began confiscating Kinder eggs by the thousands, calling them contraband candy. Kids in Europe enjoyed them freely, while American children could only dream or smuggle them from relatives abroad. Parents protested, collectors cried foul, but safety laws won. In the US, Kinder eggs were banned entirely, replaced years later by a safer, separated version, Kinder Joy. Still, for those who remember the original, nothing compares to the thrill of cracking open an egg and finding both chocolate and a toy, a forbidden combination too perfect for its own good. Fruit Roll-Ups' original recipe were the ultimate lunchbox upgrade, a sticky sheet of fruit-flavored fun that promised real fruit taste. In reality, it was closer to edible plastic coated in corn syrup. The first generation of Fruit Roll-Ups, launched in the 1980s, came loaded with artificial dyes, synthetic flavors, and enough preservatives to outlast civilization. Kids loved peeling them off wax paper, stretching them into shapes, and pretending they were eating something healthy. Parents convinced themselves they were fruit. The truth? They were sugar sculptures, with a shelf life measured in decades. When health watchdogs started questioning the ingredients, the company quietly reformulated the recipe. Less dye, fewer chemicals, more fruit concentrate. The newer versions looked cleaner but never tasted quite as wild. The original, in all its neon, sticky glory, disappeared, banned by shifting health standards and evolving food laws. But if you remember licking red dye off your fingers in 1985, you were part of an era that mistook chemistry for cuisine. Crystal Pepsi was one of the boldest and briefest soda experiments of the late 1980s. It promised purity, innovation, and the excitement of a cola without color. The clear, caffeine-free drink came in sleek glass bottles that looked more like something from a health spa than a vending machine. The marketing was futuristic, clean, minimalist, and dripping with 1980s confidence. Commercials showed waterfalls, lasers, and people in white suits drinking clarity in a bottle. It was Pepsi's boldest move yet, but the taste didn't match the hype. People lined up to try it, expecting magic, and got confusion instead. The flavor was flat, oddly sweet, and missing the bite that made cola famous. Pepsi called it clarity, but most called it weird. Within a year, the product fizzled, joining the ranks of marketing myths that burned bright and vanished fast. Critics later called it the most 1980s drink ever made, all style, no substance, and a little too confident in its own coolness. Crystal Pepsi may have been banned by poor sales, not law, but its spirit fits perfectly in this list, an idea too clean for a world that wanted its cola dark, caffeinated, and unapologetically messy. Aspartame-heavy diet drinks ruled the 1980s like artificial royalty. Every company wanted in on the low-calorie craze, and aspartame was the magic word, sweeter than sugar, with zero guilt. But behind the fizzy slogans and pastel cans was a growing storm of controversy. The commercials made it look glamorous, thin models sipping soda on beaches and boardwalks, living proof that chemistry could be chic. But reports of strange side effects, headaches, nausea, dizziness, began to spread. Health watchdogs accused companies of putting profit before safety, and suddenly, 0 calories didn't sound so refreshing. Reports of headaches, dizziness, and long-term health concerns turned the miracle sweetener into a national debate. Diet sodas that once promised vitality suddenly felt toxic, their ingredients lists sounding more like chemistry homework than refreshment. Regulators scrambled, companies reformulated, and loyal fans were left wondering if their favorite drinks were safe or secretly sinister. By the end of the decade, aspartame was under tighter scrutiny, forcing soda makers to reinvent themselves again. For those who remember the first wave of diet drinks, it was an era defined by blind faith in science and the rude awakening that followed. 3D Doritos, original formula, were snack evolution taken too far. Crunchy, puffed Doritos shaped like tiny shells of doom. Marketed as next-level snacking, they were fried in oil-heavy formulas that made them dangerously addictive, and later, questionable in the eyes of regulators. Each bite exploded with flavor dust and grease, leaving fingerprints that could identify you for days. Kids loved the sound they made, that loud, hollow crunch that echoed like fireworks. Parents hated the oil stains left on furniture, walls, and jeans. Health officials hated them even more when lab tests showed oil saturation levels bordering on hazardous. People loved the crunch, but their stomachs didn't always agree. Complaints about the oils used pushed the snack into the FDA's spotlight. For a while, 3D Doritos became the stuff of playground legend, the chip that bit back. By the early 2000s, they vanished, quietly replaced by safer and less greasy iterations. They returned years later, reformulated and rebranded, but the original remains a myth among snack enthusiasts, proof that sometimes the future of food is a little too oily to handle. Sharkleberry Fin Kool-Aid was neon pink madness in a pitcher. The flavor was supposed to be a mix of strawberry, banana, and orange, but it mostly tasted like sugar, water, and chaos. Its mascot, a surfing shark, became an icon of summertime fun, until the drink's dyes came under fire. The drink's color was so bright it could stain anything, countertops, clothes, even your tongue for a full day. Parents joked it could be used as a highlighter, but when new dye regulations came out, that joke stopped being funny. Health officials found the artificial coloring used didn't meet new safety standards, and suddenly, the shark had to swim away. Parents who once laughed at the color started reading labels for the first time. The FDA crackdown on certain dyes sealed its fate. Kool-Aid tried to replace it with other tropical flavors, but none had the same wild personality. For kids who grew up in the 1980s, Sharkleberry Fin wasn't just a drink. It was a sugar-fueled fantasy that glowed brighter than the sun and disappeared just as fast. Artificially flavored cheese sprays were the guilty pleasure that defined lazy snacking in the 1980s. Sold in bright cans with cheerful nozzles, they made you feel like a culinary genius with just one press. Cheese on crackers, cheese on chips, cheese straight into your mouth. It was instant sophistication, according to the ads, but in reality, it was a science experiment disguised as dairy. Every spray hissed with the sound of compressed air, followed by a chemical tang that smelled suspiciously like melted plastic. Some even used propellants banned in other industries, the same gases found in paint and deodorant cans. It was pure innovation gone slightly mad. Each can contained not only cheese flavoring, but also chemical propellants used in aerosol sprays, the kind that powered hairspray, not hunger. Over time, regulators realized those gases weren't exactly dinner-friendly. When health warnings started surfacing, people began wondering if their snack was slowly painting their insides. It wasn't just unhealthy, it was practically industrial. The taste was pure nostalgia, equal parts tangy and metallic, with an afterbite that lingered longer than it should. Still, for a generation raised on convenience, the can of cheese became a kitchen staple, perfect for parties, picnics, or 2 a.m. fridge raids. By the late 1980s, food safety laws caught up and those propellants were banned from edible products. Aerosol cheese lived on in reformulated form, but the original version? It was the 1980s at its finest. Bold, bad, and completely irresistible. Caffeinated chocolate bars were the ultimate 1980s hustle food. These candy bars weren't for kids. They were for stressed-out adults chasing deadlines and dreams. The sweet that keeps you going, the ads boasted, blending the comfort of chocolate with the rush of caffeine. It sounded genius until people realized they were basically eating 2 cups of coffee wrapped in sugar. The first bite tasted like victory. The second tasted like regret. People would crash hard within hours, jittery and exhausted. Some companies even marketed them to students, sparking outrage among parents and health officials alike. Each bar packed so much caffeine that your heart raced before you finished unwrapping it. Office workers swore by them. Doctors swore at them. The FDA quickly stepped in after reports of jittery customers and sleepless nights began piling up. For a while, they were everywhere, near cash registers, in vending machines, even next to energy pills at gas stations. The bars promised focus, energy, and alertness, but what they really delivered was anxiety and regret. By the end of the decade, stricter caffeine limits made them illegal to sell in grocery aisles. Today, they're remembered as the candy that tried to do too much. Dessert, coffee, and chaos, all in one bite. Squeeze Parquet. Margarine looked like the future of cooking. Smooth, golden, and ready to squirt straight from a bottle. You didn't need a knife, a dish, or even manners. Just aim and squeeze. For busy 1980s households, it was heaven in a bottle. But the dream melted fast. The plastic packaging was made with chemicals that didn't play well with heat, and kitchens tend to get hot. Over time, the bottles began leaching toxins into the margarine, especially when left near stoves or windows. Families started noticing a strange film forming on their food, slick, waxy, and nothing like butter. Laboratory tests later confirmed what everyone feared. The bottles were slowly contaminating their contents. It was the kind of convenience no one wanted anymore. The FDA wasn't impressed. Consumers noticed strange aftertastes, discoloration, and even separation inside the bottle. Parquet scrambled to defend the product, insisting it was safe when used correctly, but the damage was done. By the late 1980s, new safety rules forced the company to retire the original design. It was a reminder that even convenience has limits, especially when your easy squeeze turns into a chemical squeeze. Lead-soldered canned goods were a ticking time bomb hiding in plain sight. Before the late 1980s, many canned foods, soups, vegetables, meats, were sealed with solder containing actual lead. It kept cans airtight but made every bite a potential health hazard. Researchers began noticing dangerously high lead levels in children's blood, especially in communities relying heavily on canned food. Acidic products like tomato soup were the worst offenders, dissolving metal into every spoonful. What started as a production shortcut turned into a national health crisis. Scientists discovered that acidic foods like tomatoes and fruits were leaching the metal right into people's meals. Children's products were the worst offenders, turning lunch into slow poisoning. When the studies came out, the FDA had no choice but to act. The new rules outlawed lead solder in all canned goods, forcing companies to overhaul production lines. For years, however, the damage had already been done, especially overseas where regulations came later. Looking back, it's shocking how normal it once seemed to trust metal sealed with toxins. The ban was a turning point in food safety and a sobering lesson in how progress sometimes hides poison under a label of convenience. Sodium cyclamate. Sweeteners were the diet craze before the diet craze. Found in everything from light pudding to slim sodas, cyclamate promised sweet flavor without calories, the holy grail of 1980s food science. People believed in it, companies profited from it, and health agencies panicked over it. It was the decade's answer to indulgence without consequence, and every brand wanted in on the trend. Cafeterias, bakeries, and soda fountains stocked it proudly, certain they were serving the future of healthy sweetness. Then the studies hit, lab rats, cancer scares, and a wave of panic that turned every diet label into a potential danger sign. Early animal studies hinted that the additive might be carcinogenic, and by the mid-1980s, the United States pulled it off the market completely. Europe followed soon after, though a few countries still clung to it for years. Consumers were confused, wondering why yesterday's miracle was suddenly today's poison. The ban forced food companies to scramble for substitutes, giving rise to the aspartame era, a solution that sparked even more controversy. For many 1980s dieters, cyclamate was their first taste of betrayal. a chemical sweetheart that turned out to be a bad relationship. Fat-free, Snackwell's cookies were the guilt-free dream of 1980s grocery shoppers, and the biggest nutritional scam of its time. Introduced during the anti-fat craze, these cookies promised indulgence without consequences. They were everywhere, in office kitchens, lunchboxes, and late-night commercials urging people to snack well, live well. But to replace fat, manufacturers added mountains of sugar, starch, and artificial ingredients, creating a fat-free dessert that was anything but healthy. People devoured them by the sleeve, believing the lack of fat made them immune to guilt. Dietitians warned it was marketing trickery, but the promise of no fat, no problem was too sweet to resist. For a while, Snackwell's even became a cultural symbol of the era, the cookie that let you believe health came in a box. Nutritionists later revealed they often had more calories than regular cookies. Consumers didn't lose weight. They gained confusion. The cookies were sweet, addictive, and left you hungrier after every serving. For years, people believed they had found the loophole to dieting, until obesity rates kept climbing. By the 1990s, Snackwell's quietly reformulated or vanished from shelves, another casualty of misplaced trust in food science. It was the 1980s in a nutshell. We cut the fat, but somehow ended up with more junk. Rely tampons by Procter & Gamble were a triumph of marketing and a tragedy of science. Sold in grocery aisles and advertised as revolutionary, they promised unmatched absorbency through their unique super sponge design. For a while, they were hailed as a breakthrough in women's health. But in 1980, the dream turned deadly. The synthetic fibers used in Rely tampons were linked to toxic shock syndrome, a bacterial infection that proved fatal for dozens of women. The product's sponge-like material, designed to trap more moisture, also created the perfect environment for bacteria to grow. Doctors quickly raised alarms, but Procter & Gamble's marketing machine was faster than the science. It took a national outcry and mounting deaths for the truth to finally hit the shelves. The recall was swift, the outrage faster, and the damage permanent. Rely disappeared from stores almost overnight, but the incident changed the entire industry. New safety standards, labeling laws, and medical research came directly from the disaster. It was a haunting reminder that even innovation can go horribly wrong when profit outpaces precaution. For a generation of shoppers, Rely wasn't just a brand. It was a warning stamped in fine print. High-sodium frozen dinners were the guilty comfort of 1980s convenience culture. Every brand from Swanson to Banquet filled freezer aisles with Salisbury steak, mashed potatoes, and gravy that could outlast the apocalypse. They were fast, cheap, and dependable, the perfect meal for anyone too tired to cook after a long day. The downside? Each tray contained more salt than an ocean wave. Doctors began linking them to hypertension and heart disease, and suddenly, convenience looked like a killer. What started as a quick dinner fix turned into a health crisis on a plate. The sodium levels weren't just high. They were astronomical, often topping 2,000 milligrams in a single meal. Nutritionists joked that a Swanson dinner was less food and more brine in a box. The FDA's evolving nutritional guidelines in the late 1980s forced companies to pull or reformulate entire product lines. The old recipes disappeared, replaced by heart-healthy versions that never quite tasted the same. For people who grew up on them, it felt like losing a piece of home, the salty, buttery kind. Frozen dinners didn't die, they just got watered down, literally and figuratively. But those who remember the originals can still taste that sodium-soaked nostalgia and the guilt that came with every delicious bite. MSG-laden soup mixes were the backbone of 1980s casseroles, stews, and potluck dinners. Every home cook had a few packets stashed away, ready to transform boring chicken into culinary magic. "Just add water," the boxes said, and families did, by the millions. The flavor was bold, addictive, and unmistakably artificial. Then came the MSG scare, A flood of reports blaming monosodium glutamate for headaches, fatigue, and Chinese restaurant syndrome. Overnight, something that once meant flavor now meant fear. MSG became public enemy number one thanks to sensational headlines and questionable studies. Suddenly, housewives who'd spent years cooking with it were tossing it in the trash. Even companies that knew the science was shaky jumped ship to avoid backlash. Manufacturers scrambled to hide it under new names like hydrolyzed protein. Supermarkets purged shelves and recipe books quietly rewrote themselves. The craze for all-natural cooking that followed changed the way America seasoned its food forever. By the 1990s, MSG's reputation was unfairly destroyed, though science later found little evidence of harm. Still, those old packets disappeared for good, taking with them a flavor so intense it almost made you forget what real food tasted like. Pre-packaged tuna salad kits with mayonnaise packets were a lunchtime revolution gone wrong. Designed for workers and students on the go, they came with everything you needed: crackers, tuna, and a tiny pouch of mayonnaise. All you had to do was mix and eat. Simple, right? Until stores started noticing the kits spoiling on shelves. The heat-sensitive mayonnaise packets were breaking down in transit, creating a bacterial playground inside the package. Even sealed, the kits were quietly festering, the tuna sweating, the mayo curdling. Some customers opened theirs to find greenish residue or an unmistakable sour smell. It wasn't just unappetizing, it was unsafe. Reports of food poisoning began surfacing, and grocery chains pulled them overnight. Consumers felt betrayed. A product marketed as safe and convenient had turned risky and rancid. By the early 1990s, new packaging laws banned unrefrigerated mayo kits entirely. Tuna lunch kits later returned with shelf-stable formulas, but the trust was gone. The original kits are remembered as the lunchbox equivalent of a ticking time bomb, one that exploded not with sound, but with stomach aches. Blue Pepsi in the 1980s was an experiment that looked like the future, until the future banned it. It was Pepsi's first foray into color innovation, a glowing cobalt drink that turned heads on store shelves. The blue hue was mesmerizing, electric, and unapologetically artificial, giving the soda an almost science fiction vibe. But the secret behind that brilliant color was less exciting. Chemical dyes, later deemed unsafe for human consumption. The dyes used, like Blue Number 1 and a few experimental additives, were linked to toxicity concerns after being tested in animals. Some reports even hinted at allergic reactions in sensitive drinkers. For a while, Pepsi brushed it off, calling it color evolution. The FDA called it something else, a violation. Stores pulled it from shelves quietly, and Pepsi moved on to safer formulations. Still, for anyone who tasted it, Blue Pepsi was unforgettable. Syrupy, neon, and strangely metallic, like drinking an electric wire. It was the 1980s bottled, loud, bold, and completely unbothered by health warnings until it was too late. The idea would later resurface decades later in the 1990s with Pepsi Blue, but that version was a sanitized echo of the original. The first Blue Pepsi remains a bright, toxic symbol of a decade that never met a bad idea it couldn't package and sell. Orbit's drink looked like a science experiment, and honestly, it kind of was. The glass bottles were filled with colorful liquid and tiny gelatin beads that floated mid-air like some kind of edible lava lamp. It was marketed as a drink from the future, combining 1990s aesthetics with 1980s optimism. The problem was, no one knew what it actually was, or if it was safe. The suspended beads were made from gel-in gum, an unapproved additive at the time. Regulators later found the formula didn't meet food safety standards, citing issues with consistency, stability, and digestion. Consumers were equally confused, half fascinated, half disgusted. The drink's texture was bizarre, thick yet watery, with chewy bits that made every sip a dare. People bought it once for the novelty, took a sip, and left the rest on the shelf. Within a year, the futuristic beverage was banned from most markets and quietly discontinued. Today, surviving bottles sell for hundreds of dollars online, still sealed, not because anyone wants to drink them, but because they looked like relics from an alternate reality where taste didn't matter. Orbits was what happens when marketing dreams too big and science says absolutely not. The artificial whipped cream in pressurized glass cans was a disaster waiting to happen, and in the 1980s it finally did. Long before aluminum cans became standard, some whipped cream brands packaged their product in sleek, clear glass bottles to show off the rich texture inside. They looked beautiful in commercials, frosty, elegant, and perfectly premium. But behind that gloss was a bomb. The pressurized nitrous oxide used to propel the cream reacted unpredictably with the glass, especially when stored in cold grocery freezers. Several cans shattered or outright exploded, sending shards and whipped cream flying. Supermarkets reported injuries, lawsuits followed, and regulators stepped in immediately. The product was recalled nationwide within months, replaced by safer aluminum designs. Some brands tried to blame improper storage, but consumers weren't buying it, literally or figuratively. The incident reshaped how aerosol products were tested and handled in the food industry. For a while, though, it was pure chaos. Aisles covered in cream, warning signs posted in freezer sections, and one more lesson learned about how form should never beat function. The glass cans disappeared forever, but their story lives on as one of the strangest explosions in grocery history. Tartar Control potato chips sounded like a joke, and honestly, it probably should have stayed one. In an era obsessed with innovation, some marketing genius decided that vinegar-flavored chips should taste more cleansing. So they launched Tartar Control chips, seasoned with acidic compounds meant to mimic the tang of tartar sauce. They hit the shelves in select stores in the mid-1980s and were gone almost immediately. Customers hated them. The flavor was a sour, greasy mess that coated your mouth in salt and regret. Health experts didn't love them either, since the acidic oils were harsh on enamel and stomach lining. Even the name was off-putting. No one wants dental hygiene in their snack aisle. By the time complaints reached the FDA, the brand had already started pulling inventory. Some blamed a bad batch, others blamed bad judgment. But either way, the clean chip experiment ended in disgrace. Years later, collectors still talk about the packaging. A smiling tooth holding a bag of chips, blissfully unaware of its fate. Tartar Control chips became the ultimate punchline in the 1980s snack lore. Proof that not every new idea deserves to make it past the brainstorming stage. Canned meat spreads with nitrates were the lunchtime staple nobody questioned, until they did. Sold as savory protein spreads, these canned concoctions were made for crackers, sandwiches, and cold buffets. The flavor was meaty, salty, and vaguely metallic, and for decades, it was considered perfectly normal. But the secret ingredient keeping it fresh wasn't so innocent. Tests in the late 1980s revealed nitrate and nitrite levels far above the FDA's safe limits, preservatives that, when heated or stored improperly, could form carcinogenic compounds. The cans also contained sodium so high it could qualify as a cure-all for bland food and bad decisions. Health experts sounded the alarm, and grocery stores scrambled to pull the worst offenders. The ban came quietly, replaced by reformulated versions with reduced nitrates and shorter shelf lives. For people who grew up spreading it on crackers at family picnics, the news felt like betrayal. One more comfort food turned cautionary tale. Today, nitrate-free deli meats are everywhere, but those old cans remain a haunting reminder of how the 1980s traded safety for shelf stability. It was the era of forever food until regulators decided forever was far too long. Swanson's canned whole chicken was proof that humanity will try anything once and only once. Picture this: you open a can, tip it upside down, and a pale, boneless bird slithers out with the texture of a wet towel. It was supposed to be a miracle of efficiency. An entire roasted chicken in one can, but it looked like something out of a horror movie. When it hit the plate, it made a sickening thud that echoed through kitchens like a warning. The skin had the look of melted plastic, the color of sadness, and the consistency of gelatin. Housewives gagged mid-dinner prep, while husbands pretended to be brave enough to taste it. Even the family dog, normally loyal and forgiving, took one sniff and retreated. The broth it came in was greasy, gelatinous, and vaguely alive, clinging to the chicken like regret. Housewives in the 1970s tried to make casseroles or sandwiches with it, but most couldn't get past the smell. Swanson insisted it was tender and flavorful, but photographs alone destroyed appetites nationwide. It was the kind of food you kept in your pantry only for the end of the world, and even then you might think twice. Opening one wasn't cooking. It was trauma in aluminum form. Somewhere between progress and punishment, this canned bird became the symbol of everything wrong with 1970s convenience dining. Riding bikes without helmets was not considered dangerous. It was considered growing up. Children in the 1980s owned scraped knees, stubbed toes, and chipped teeth like badges of honor. You grabbed your bike and took off the moment the sun came up, racing friends through alleys, sidewalks, and backyards. The wind whipped your face. The world blurred past. Helmets were rare. If anyone had one, it was likely for motocross or medical reasons. Most parents did not even think to suggest it. Bike safety was taught through scraped elbows, not pamphlets. You rode with your shoelaces untied, your backpack swinging, maybe even one hand holding a soda. Some bikes had pegs, others had banana seats, but almost none had helmets. Today, many states have helmet laws, especially for children under 18. Schools give lessons. Parents buy reflective gear. But for that earlier generation, the only thing protecting your head was your luck and your reflexes. It was risky, yes, but also exhilarating. And while today's parents would call that neglect, the freedom to take risks was part of what made childhood feel so vast. Just like thumbing a ride down the highway felt like part of growing up for teenagers and travelers alike. The atomic age had arrived, and even your morning coffee wanted in on the action. In the 1950s, atomic coffee sets were the height of chic. Sleek mugs and saucers coated in uranium glaze that gave off a faint, mesmerizing glow under certain lights. Advertisements promised a radiant start to your day, which, in hindsight, feels like a cruel joke. Housewives loved the modern look. Scientists probably cringed. It was the perfect marriage of danger and design. Elegant, sophisticated, and quietly radioactive. The uranium added a bright coral orange color that was considered ultra-fashionable. Nobody thought twice about the risks. If it was new, it had to be safe. Guests admired the shimmer as coffee cups clinked, completely unaware they were sipping from mild radiation sources. The atomic coffee set was the perfect symbol of mid-century faith in science. Beautiful, dangerous, and utterly misguided. Eventually, regulations banned uranium glazes, but the pieces survived in antique shops, their faint glow now a haunting reminder of how even breakfast couldn't escape the atomic craze. Tang breakfast cereal was what happened when someone took the phrase "part of a complete breakfast" far too literally. The famous orange drink powder got a crunchy upgrade because apparently drinking it wasn't enough. It came in small, sugary nuggets that promised the flavor of sunshine and delivered the taste of battery acid. The first crunch was shocking, sharp citrus with a metallic aftertaste that burned like orange cleaner. Within seconds, the cereal disintegrated into orange foam, turning milk into a radioactive sludge. Kids dared each other to finish a bowl, while parents quietly questioned humanity's progress. Even Tang's creators pretended it never happened. Pouring milk over it turned breakfast into a chemical experiment. The milk fizzed, the cereal melted, and nothing about it felt safe. Kids were curious once, parents never twice. NASA may have used Tang in space, but this version belonged in the trash. It was sweet, sour, and somehow both dry and sticky. The only thing this cereal fueled was regret. Tang tried to conquer breakfast twice, once as a drink, once as a disaster, and both times it left a bad taste in history. Hitchhiking was once seen as adventurous, not reckless. People stuck out their thumbs with a smile and a sign, hoping for a ride and maybe a story. Soldiers on leave, college students on break, wanderers with a dream, they all relied on the kindness of strangers. Roads were filled with possibilities, and nobody thought twice about pulling over. You might remember watching someone hop into a stranger's car and wave goodbye, trusting the road and the driver. It was how many got from one town to the next, especially before cheap bus fares and ride-sharing apps. Parents might warn you to be careful, but that was the extent of the worry. Hitchhiking was not illegal in most places. It was resourceful. Over time, though, stories of assaults, disappearances, and crimes changed the narrative. Laws tightened. Signs went up, "No hitchhiking." Now, in many states, it is restricted or outright banned. The open road closed itself off. Hitchhiking became a symbol of risk rather than freedom. But for those who once stuck out their thumb and caught a ride with a stranger, it still lives in memory as a gesture of trust. And just as strangers were trusted, so were quiet children waiting patiently in cars, alone. If there's one thing the 1950s loved, it was convenience at any cost, and that includes the risk of spontaneous combustion. Before electricity was everywhere, portable hairdryers were fueled by small gasoline tanks. Picture this: a woman in curlers, helmet strapped tight, sitting next to a whirring canister of flammable fuel. The ads promised salon-quality results and freedom from outlets. The reality? A head full of curls and nerves. Manufacturers claimed it was completely safe so long as you didn't use it near open flames, which in mid-century kitchens were practically everywhere. Despite the danger, people bought them anyway. Beauty was progress, and progress often came with hazard warnings. The fumes filled small bathrooms while the warm air puffed across the face, creating that unmistakable modern woman glow. It was the decade when innovation sprinted ahead of logic and nobody wanted to be left behind, even if their hair routine sounded like a science experiment. The gasoline hairdryer didn't last long, thankfully, but it remains one of those marvels of mid-century madness, a time when the dream of convenience sometimes went up in smoke. Betty Crocker. Instant potato buds tried their best to convince America that flakes could be fancy. They weren't. Marketed as light, fluffy, and elegant, these so-called buds were just dehydrated potato dust puffed into tiny granules. Add hot water, and you were supposed to get mashed potatoes. But what you really got was wallpaper paste with a faint scent of cafeteria sadness. They were so bland, even salt gave up trying to help. The consistency was somewhere between paste and pudding, coating every spoon in a thick, lifeless film. No amount of butter or milk could disguise the taste of despair. The box showed perfect golden mounds topped with melting butter, but inside was a bag of white powder that smelled vaguely like chalk. Housewives felt cheated, kids cried, and even dogs hesitated to finish a plate. The word buds was meant to sound cute and gourmet, like something grown instead of manufactured. But one spoonful proved otherwise. The texture clung to spoons like wet cement, and the flavor hovered somewhere between stale crackers and dust bunnies. Despite this, the product somehow survived into the 1980s, stubbornly holding its place on supermarket shelves next to real potatoes, a quiet insult to every farmer who ever lived. Instant potato buds weren't convenience food. They were surrender disguised as supper. No seatbelt use was not just common, it was practically invisible. Cars came with seatbelts, but they were rarely used. Children piled into the back seat without a second thought, curling up with pillows, playing games, or hanging their heads out the window like golden retrievers. On long trips, siblings would wrestle or lie down to nap across the entire back row. Adults, too, often left their belts untouched, especially in the front passenger seat. The seatbelt light was just an annoying feature, easily ignored. There were no alarms, no relentless dings, just silence and freedom. Many people viewed seatbelts as unnecessary unless they were driving fast or on highways. Some even believed they were more dangerous during crashes. It was not until the late 1980s and early 1990s that states began to enforce seatbelt laws. Today, it is a non-negotiable. Not buckling up can cost you money, your license, or your child's safety. But back then, you were more likely to get in trouble for forgetting to bring home milk than for not wearing a belt. And if the roads were that casual, imagine how carefree kids were on their bikes, zooming through neighborhoods without a helmet in sight. In the 1950s, asbestos was the miracle material that could do no wrong. It insulated buildings, lined stoves, and yes, even protected your hands in the kitchen. Asbestos oven mitts were hailed as a breakthrough for homemakers. Finally, gloves that never burn. And they didn't, unless you count your lungs. Housewives proudly slipped their hands into the gray, fibrous mitts, lifting hot pans without fear while unknowingly inhaling microscopic poison. The ads showed smiling mothers baking casseroles in peace, blissfully unaware of the ticking health hazard they wore like armor. At the time, asbestos was considered the gold standard for safety. It was the paradox of the post-war era, science solving one problem while quietly creating another. By the 1970s, the truth caught up. Asbestos caused deadly respiratory diseases, and those miracle mitts became symbols of misplaced trust. Still, in its moment, asbestos represented everything the 1950s believed in: modern, efficient, and just a little too good to be true. Ham and lima beans in a can was the ultimate punishment meal, a Depression-era relic revived by people who should have known better. Reheated, it smelled like defeat. Cold, it looked like camouflage. Inside every can were pale lima beans drowning in greasy pink sludge, clinging to chunks of salty ham that dissolved on contact. It looked like something that should be studied, not eaten. The texture shifted between mush and grit, making each bite feel like a dare. Housewives in the 1970s bought it once, thinking it might save dinner, then buried the rest of the cans in shame. Even soldiers who ate field rations called it cruel. It was supposed to be hearty comfort food, but it was more like a test of endurance. Even people who grew up poor swore they'd rather go hungry than face another can. Advertisers pitched it as a taste of tradition, which was technically true, if that tradition was suffering. Every bite tasted like the past refusing to die. Ham and lima beans became a symbol of culinary regression, proving that nostalgia can sometimes be a terrible idea. Children riding in the front seats of cars was an everyday sight, and often a point of pride. Sitting up front made you feel older, more important. You got to fiddle with the radio, point at road signs, and chat with mom or dad like a co-pilot. No one thought about airbags because there were not any. Booster seats were rare, and height limits did not exist. Some kids were barely out of diapers, sitting inches from the windshield. It was not defiance, it was just convenience. Parents wanted to keep an eye on you, or maybe you just begged until they said yes. You might remember leaning over to see the map or falling asleep with your head against the door. Today, it is illegal in many states for children under a certain age or weight to ride in the front seat. Airbags are now both a safety feature and a reason for strict backseat policies. But back then, the rules were unspoken and the risks were invisible. And if you think sitting up front was bold, try remembering what they used to hand to kids on the 4th of July. Explosives in a paper bag. The post-war dream of automation didn't stop at cars and kitchens. It extended straight up the nostrils. The electric nose hair zapper promised a hands-free grooming revolution by using small electric currents to burn unwanted hair at the root. You'd insert 2 tiny metal probes into your nose, flip the switch, and wait for precision results. What you got instead was a small jolt of pain and a whiff of singed regret. The device claimed to be safe and gentle, but anyone who owned one would beg to differ. It hummed ominously, sparked occasionally, and had a habit of shocking users in places that had nothing to do with their noses. Still, men adored the gadget. It made grooming feel mechanical, masculine, and a little dangerous. It was the decade of the do-it-yourself daredevil, where even shaving could feel like science fiction gone wrong. Each spark inside your nose was a reminder that the future had arrived, and it definitely hurt. It was progress you could smell, literally. Nothing said 1950s modernity like the faint aroma of ozone mixed with scorched hair. The electric nose hair zapper vanished quickly from shelves, taking countless nose hairs and a few brave egos with it. But its spirit lived on in every gadget that promised comfort through mild discomfort. A truly electrifying legacy. Carnation breakfast bars were supposed to revolutionize mornings. all the nutrition of breakfast in a single bar. They didn't. Instead, they crumbled like chalk before you even got them out of the wrapper. People describe the texture as dry dirt held together by sadness. Even the chocolate coating couldn't save them. It melted faster than the bar fell apart. Some people tried microwaving them for softness, but that only made the smell worse. People joked that they were eating drywall, with less flavor. The bars were supposed to provide protein and energy, but most of it ended up as crumbs in car seats and lunchboxes. Even dunking them in milk didn't help. They just dissolved into sludge. They were dry, gritty, and somehow both sticky and powdery at once. The kind of food that left you thirstier than before you ate it. Parents packed them for convenience. Kids traded them for anything edible. Carnation promised energy that lasts all day. But most people were hungry again by 9 a.m. The bars came in flavors like chocolate chip and peanut butter, but they all tasted like sawdust with ambition. They joined the long line of 1970s food that valued science over flavor, proving once again that complete nutrition means nothing if you can't swallow it. Mercury thermometers were a household staple, used on babies, adults, even pets. Tucked in bathroom drawers or first aid kits, they were slim, silver, and dangerously beautiful. If you were sick, your mom would shake the thermometer to reset the mercury, then slide it under your tongue or arm. You waited in silence, watching the silvery liquid rise and hold its place. Nobody questioned it. It was science. It was routine. But those thermometers were filled with mercury, a potent neurotoxin that could poison the air if the glass broke, and they often did. A slip from the counter or a hard shake could send beads of mercury rolling across the floor like tiny balls of doom. Most families wiped them up with tissues or brooms, unaware of the harm. Today, mercury thermometers have been almost entirely phased out, replaced by digital ones that beep instead of shimmer. But for kids of the 80s, that little glass stick was part of every fever, every flu, every call to grandma for what to do next. And just like nobody questioned the mercury, nobody questioned mixing alcohol with open water, especially when summer meant floating down a river without a care in the world. The 1950s had a deep belief that electricity could fix anything, from radios to wrinkles to waistlines. That's how the electric shock beauty slimmer was born. It looked like a harmless belt, but this contraption sent actual electric pulses through your midsection, claiming to stimulate muscles and melt away fat. Housewives were told they could lose inches while reading magazines, their bodies quietly buzzing with science. It was the perfect marriage of vanity and voltage, where glamour met gadgetry in the most shocking way possible. Housewives trusted the hum of electricity more than the hum of their own instincts. The ads made it sound elegant. Plug in, lie down, and let electricity do the hard work. But in reality, it was less spa treatment and more small-scale electrocution. Some users described the sensation as tingling, while others said it felt like wrestling a live wire. Doctors warned that fat doesn't vanish by voltage, but the 1950s wasn't a decade for skepticism. It was a decade for hope packaged in chrome. These shock belts promised what everyone wanted: beauty without effort, results without sweat, and progress you could literally feel. They didn't tone muscles, but they certainly raised heart rates. And if you happened to survive without a burn mark, you could proudly say you'd experienced the future, painfully. Like so many inventions of the era, it wasn't about whether it worked, it was about believing it should. Jell-O savory flavors were the culinary equivalent of a dare. Celery, tomato, and mixed vegetable, words that should never be followed by gelatin dessert. In the 1970s, homemakers were told to mold everything, so Jell-O thought, why not salad? The result was wobbly towers of confusion served proudly at luncheons. Each bite felt like betrayal. Cold, rubbery vegetables suspended in sweet goo. The tomato flavor tasted like spaghetti sauce that lost its will to live, while the celery one just crunched wrong. People tried to convince themselves it was classy, cutting into it with forced smiles as children watched in horror. Even the family cat refused samples. The flavor was as bad as it sounds. Imagine slurping a cold tomato soup that fights back. Even worse, these mixes were often paired with tuna, olives, or boiled eggs suspended like fossils in lime slime. Magazine ads called them innovative. Dinner guests called them a cry for help. Every bite was a journey through texture and poor judgment. Jell-O proved that not all foods should jiggle, and certainly not ones that tasted like vegetables and regret. Teachers paddling students in school was not a scandal. It was school policy. Across much of the South and Midwest, corporal punishment was written directly into the student handbook. You misbehaved and you got a warning. Do it again, and you were sent to the hallway or the principal's office, where a thick wooden paddle waited behind the door. The ritual was matter-of-fact. Bending over, hands on your knees, 3 quick swats. Then back to class. It was not seen as abuse. It was called discipline. Parents usually sided with the school. Some even thanked the teacher. You might remember classmates whispering about who got licks that week, or seeing a boy walk back into the room red-faced and silent. Today, physical punishment in schools is banned in a majority of states, with strict protections in place for student rights and well-being. What once passed as character building is now considered physical harm. But in the 1980s, teachers held power that reached beyond textbooks. And if kids were being punished like adults, it is no surprise that they were also being treated like adults in other dangerous ways, like riding up front in moving vehicles without a second thought. If elegance could kill, 1950s cosmetics nearly succeeded. The decade's compacts and powders often contained lead, giving them a smooth finish and that pearly sheen women adored. Ads promised youthful radiance and long-lasting coverage, conveniently skipping the part about chronic poisoning. Women carried them everywhere, tiny, glamorous mirrors of a toxic truth. Beauty in the 1950s wasn't just about looking flawless. It was about keeping up with the illusion that modern science made everything safe. Each compact held a quiet contradiction. Glamour on the surface, danger underneath. The glow was real, but so was the risk. Repeated use led to fatigue, anemia, and worse, though few connected the dots. Beauty was supposed to require sacrifice, and in the 1950s, that saying was literal. It was the golden age of surface perfection, where danger hid beneath the shimmer. Eventually, safety laws caught up, but for a generation of women, the price of beauty had already been paid, one powder puff at a time. Gerber Singles for adults was marketed as the perfect meal solution for lonely working grown-ups, and somehow that idea was even sadder than it sounds. Imagine sitting at your desk, spooning lukewarm beef burgundy or banana prune out of a baby food jar while pretending your life choices made sense. These jars were identical to what babies ate, only now you were supposed to feel sophisticated about it. The company promised portion control and convenient dining, but really it was just mashed sadness in glass form. The flavors were mushy, bland, and uncomfortably familiar, grown-ups rediscovering what it felt like to have no teeth and no dignity. Advertisers tried to spin it as modern efficiency, but even 1970s consumers had limits. Within months, store shelves cleared, not from demand, but from embarrassment. Gerber learned the hard way that adults do not want to be reminded of their infancy at lunchtime. The idea may have been practical, but it turned eating into an act of defeat. In the end, Gerber Singles became the punchline of a decade defined by weird convenience food, a baby step in the wrong direction. In the 1950s, modern parents were promised freedom, and fresh air came with a side of danger. The baby cage was a metal box that literally hung outside apartment windows, like an air conditioning unit for infants. City parents, desperate for space, were told this was the perfect solution. Give your baby sunshine and ventilation without stepping outside. The idea sounded wholesome enough until you saw it dangling over busy streets several stories up. The contraption was made of wire mesh, secured by bolts and bravery. Inside, a baby would nap peacefully, swinging in the urban breeze while mom made lunch. Magazines praised it as innovation. Neighbors probably prayed it wouldn't fall. It came with a safety guarantee, though that guarantee was mostly optimism disguised as engineering. Yet for many parents, it represented progress. They believed science and convenience could conquer even common sense. And in some ways, it did. because plenty of babies really did air out like flower boxes for years. The baby cage perfectly captured the decade's blind faith in modern invention. Anything new had to be better, no matter how absurd or risky it looked. Looking back, it's equal parts ingenious and horrifying, the kind of invention that makes you wonder how humanity survived its own creativity. Which of these banned 1980s grocery items shocked you the most? Tell us in the comments. Hit like if nostalgia made you double-check your pantry, and subscribe so we can keep uncovering the wild, weird, and unforgettable foods time tried to erase.